Rings on her fingers. Long ago, in a town on the coast, a man named Bernard was traveling. It was already quite late, and he was so very tired. Bernard asked the innkeeper if he had any rooms to spare, but the inn was already full. Bernard begged the innkeeper for some place to stay, as he was far too tired to keep going. The old innkeeper sighed and eventually told Bernard that he did, in fact, have a single room left, but he didn't rent it out anymore. Bernard was excited about the news of an available room, and he was curious about why it wasn't available. He asked if there was something wrong with it. The innkeeper shook his head and said that there seemed to be a bad habit with those who stayed in the room. For the past year, anyone who stayed in the room ended up fleeing away in the middle of the night, never to be seen or heard from again. The news of the disappearances had started to frighten people, so the innkeeper decided to stop renting the room. While Bernard did find this to be worrying, he was too tired to care. He begged the innkeeper to let him stay and promised that he wouldn't run out. After all, he was far too tired to run away. The innkeeper agreed and gave Bernard a key and sent him on his way. When Bernard reached the room, he looked around. There weren't any signs of anything amiss. Sure, the room was a little cold and a bit dusty from having sat unused, but it was nothing to be frightened of. There was one thing, however, that caught his eye: the large painting hanging over the bed. In the center of the large painting was a woman. She wore a pretty yellow dress and had long brown hair. She herself would have been beautiful if not for her smile. Something about it was rather creepy. The other thing that stood out to Bernard were her gloved hands. Over the gloves, she wore 3 different rings. None of them matched or looked like they belonged on the hand of a dainty woman. Bernard looked down at his own hand, which wore a similar type of ring. It was a little odd, but nothing more. Looking at the painting gave him an uneasy feeling for some reason, but despite this, Bernard really was so very tired, and so he climbed right into bed and immediately fell asleep. Bernard only slept a short while, though, as he was soon awoken by a strange noise. Bernard sat upright and looked all around the room. Just then, he noticed that his window was open. Bernard laughed to himself. He hadn't remembered opening it, but he was so tired he had likely not even noticed it. The noise must have come from the open window. He got up and closed it. On his way back to bed, he looked up a painting again. He couldn't be sure, but Bernard couldn't help thinking the woman looked a little closer. He got shivers at the thought, but shook away the silly idea. He needed more sleep. He wouldn't let a creepy painting make a liar out of him. He wasn't going to run out in the middle of the night. Another hour passed, and Bernard was yet again awoken. The room was terribly cold, and, worse yet, he thought he heard the sound of a woman giggling. This frightened Bernard quite a bit. He jumped out of bed and searched high and low, but again, nothing was out of place. It must have been someone in another room. Still tired, Bernard headed back for bed again, and once more he looked up a painting. This time, Bernard was sure the woman was closer, and this time her smile looked wider and creepier. His gut told him to grab his things and run, but he was still too tired to make it to the next town over, and he had given his word to the innkeeper. So Bernard tried his best to clear the unhappy thoughts from his mind. After all, paintings don't move. Once again, Bernard crawled into bed. This time he stayed awake for a while and just listened. A bit of time passed and nothing happened. Bernard grew frustrated with himself for being silly and decided to go back to sleep that instant. And so he did. However, just like before, Bernard was soon woken up again. This time, it was because of the sounds of heavy, raspy breaths. It took a while for Bernard to fully wake up. He lay with his eyes shut, the sound of breathing getting louder and closer. The room was growing so chilly that he could feel goosebumps rising up on his skin. Bernard had a terrible feeling in his gut. He was frightened to open his eyes and see what was there. Very slowly he opened his eyes, and all the color drained from his face. There above him, just inches away, was the woman with the eerie smile. She was leaning out over a frame of a painting, inches from his face. Her long, spindly fingers wrapped around his mouth, silencing his screams. Morning came, and Bernard did not come down to check out of his room. The old innkeeper was frustrated and went to check on him. He opened the door and saw nothing amiss. Just like all the times before, Bernard had left all his belongings and ran off into the night. So much for his promise. Muttering under his breath, the old innkeeper looked up at the painting over the bed. Seeing the piece, his frown softened into a calm smile. He had gotten the painting a year ago from a traveling merchant, and he simply adored the beautiful piece. The woman wore a soft and gentle smile, and stared back at the innkeeper peacefully. Her dainty gloved hands were clasped in front of her, 4 rings sparkling on her fingers.